Greetings, Dr. B here to talk to you about psychology as a science. Now, this is a very introductory look at psychology as a science. And as we go through this, just so you know, if you're interested in any of the topics, chances are you can find additional presentations that dive deeper into each of these topics. If not right now, in the next week or so. Ugh. Greetings, Dr. B here to talk to you today about psychology as a science. Now, today's presentation is primarily a general overview for most of the topics that we're talking about. You can check back to the channel and get even more additional information on them either today or even sometime into the future. So let's talk about psychology. One of the number one reasons why I think students decide to study psychology or other people read about it is really because of curiosity. People are naturally curious about um, what psychology studies, but psychology itself is a science. It's not enough to be curious. There are certain methodologies and certain approaches that we take in order to make sense of the mind, of behavior. There's a process that we go through to make sure that we're not just being swept up in beliefs or ideas. And ultimately, we are attempting to try to mitigate bias because the truth of the matter is all humans are born with bias. And right now, if you're sitting there going, no, 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 not me. I see other people have bias, but I don't have that much bias. That in and of itself is called the ostrich effect bias. When we present to people that they might be biased, they actually are more likely to deny the biases that they might naturally recognize otherwise. So, what is psychology? First and foremost, it's a science. It's a science not because of what we study, but because of how we study it. And what we're studying is the mind, cognition, and behavior, not just in humans, but also in animals. In order to do this, psychology is what I call a dance between two different epistemological approaches. One of them is rationalism, and the other one is empiricism. You certainly can find a slide about epistemology, that is, how do we know what we know? It's the study of how do we know what we know, um, on this channel. So psychology is that dance between rationalism, logic, and empiricism, gathering data to test that logic. And we call this the scientific method. You can also find a slide that dives more into scientific method on this channel. So ultimately, we are looking to test our hypotheses, right? And we do that in this systematic way, which we call research methodology. The ultimate goal of this is not just to get at an answer, any answer, it's to get past our natural cognitive biases that we possess so that we can have an objective, replicatable, and data-driven answer over just what our gut or intuition is telling us or what other people are telling us to other forms of epistemology. So cognitively speaking, our biases really function as a mental trap, right? And there are lots and lots of different biases. I already brought one up, the ostrich effect. But the five biggest biases that researchers are really trying to get around are confirmation bias. That is, here's my hypothesis, this is what I think is going to happen, and I'm going to seek evidence to show that I'm right. Well, if we do that, we normally are going to miss a whole bunch of pieces of evidence as to why we are wrong, right? And I'm sure you've seen this in your friends and family. A perfect example is maybe your bestie is, in love, and they found their true love, and you're looking at this person that they're with, and you're like, wait a minute. I know you can do better than this. But to them, they're like, oh, wow, I'm in love. And their confirmation bias shows them that this person is the right person. Oh, my beloved brought me my favorite cookies ever. And that's what they're focusing on. And you're focusing on, well, they went into your wallet and took money out of your wallet to buy those cookies. Shouldn't you have a problem with that? Confirmation bias, it acts as blinders. We don't even see things that go against whatever it is that our initial belief, or in the case of research, our hypothesis is. So we need to design our studies to get around that. Social desirability is another real challenge. And in fact, it's probably the biggest cognitive bias that I don't always get around in my research. And so, but we have to be aware of it, and recognize it. And it is something that I'm searching for in my research so that we can figure out a way to get beyond social desirability. What social desirability is when you bring in a research participant and there's a socially desirable way for them to respond, right? So I do training in success, and I bring people in and I say, hey, using deliberate practice, setting goals, having a go-to team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is really important for people who want to be successful. And then I test them to say, are you engaging in deliberate practice? And they're like, yes, yes, I'm engaging in deliberate practice. But they might not be. They might just simply be giving me the answer that's socially desirable because they want to be successful. So they're going to want to give answers that align with success. This creates studying the effects of the interventions that I do on research participants quite challenging because I'm always battling this social desirability bias of their desire to fake good, right? So the observer bias, this one's actually really challenging. And I did this study once with my students, and I wish I would have recorded it because I think it would have been fun for people to see. I had two different undergraduate students come in. The one person was very clearly of an ilk that would not necessarily exhibit or exude military experience. Interestingly enough, though, he actually had been in the military before he was a student. The other person, everything about him, just, he stood up tall, he, muscular, chunk, 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 like a military person. And we took the students, randomly assigned them to one of two conditions, and had the non-military person come in and just give a little bit of a statement regarding a military effort that was going on within the United States and how maybe it wasn't what was the most humane. And the other person came in his military stance and talked about the importance of the military and yada yada yada. And then we gave these two groups of students who had the same students just randomly assigned with two different observers in the room and asked them to talk about the importance or evaluate the importance of this particular military action being taken by the United States. And everybody in the one student's room who did not look like he was part of the military at all, even though, again, he was a veteran, said no, this was not a good use of taxpayer dollars in having the military engage in this particular way. And everybody in the other room was like, yes, we must do this. And we brought them back into the room, and they were shocked at the difference. But a researcher can come in and just with a smile or a nudge or certain combinations of words or even just posture or how they walk around the room or whether they're male or female, all of these things have the potential to take whatever the researcher's expectation is and push it towards the participant in a way that it changes how they respond. Of course, the other possibility is that they could look at the data in a particular way. This is really troubling with qualitative research. And so we have these different places where observation bias or observer bias could really just push the study in one direction or another that we don't want to go. My favorite is hindsight bias. Actually, I don't think I have a favorite bias. Whatever bias I'm talking about is my favorite bias. But the hindsight bias is an interesting one because, you spend all of this time doing this research and you work on it and work on it and work on it. And prior to that point, nobody believes it. There's nobody talking about it. And then after the fact, everybody's like, oh, I knew it all along. I think one of the most perfect examples of this that took place in my lifetime is this idea of oncoviruses, that an oncovirus is a virus that can cause cancer, like HPV. And I remember when the first time I heard that a virus could cause cancer. And my first thought was, oh, I wonder how. But it was interesting because everybody else that was in the room with me when this was being discussed was like, there's no way. And back in the 70s, people were saying there was no way that a virus could be causing cancer. And now we know, yes, there is this entire class of viruses that we call oncoviruses that do cause cancer. And if I were to say this to anybody now, they'd be like, oh, of course viruses cause cancer. Hindsight bias. It's after the fact. It's already been demonstrated and it's now accepted wisdom. And people just believe that they would have understood that all along. And yet the pushback in this space of research was really quite high. Hindsight bias happens all of the time in psychological research because we get to the end and we have an answer, and everybody's like, well, yeah, of course that's true. But we didn't know it until we tested it and found out. The availability heuristic is an interesting bias. That's the one that gives people the sense that flying on a plane is less safe than driving in a car, even though the data say otherwise. But when there's a automobile accident, a lot of times, we don't hear all of that much about it. But when there's a airplane crash, particularly if it's a big one and there's been lots of life, there's lots of talk about it to the point that when we think about these, it's easier to grab a hold of a memory of an airplane accident than it is of an automobile accident, unless it was an automobile accident that impacted us much more readily. So this availability heuristic gives us a false sense that flying is less safe than driving a car when the data say otherwise. Now, here's the thing. You put forward research, you design your hypothesis, you design the study, you collect the data, you analyze the data, you draw a conclusion. That's not the end of science. Science is only science if we share the knowledge. And so there's a general path of that knowledge. It's not a complete linear path. It's not always this way. But in general, you do research, you come up with a conclusion based on what you find in your lab or your various approach. And then you take it, you present it at a research conference. Those research conferences, like Eastern Psychological Association, or Association for Psychological Science, or Psychonomics, these research conferences are peer reviewed, and you have to apply to get accepted to be allowed to present a poster. A lot of times you might be invited to present your research if you are, if your research is that well known. And but normally a conference is where you go before you publish what you're doing. And then you write it up in a journal article and you submit it to a journal where it goes through a peer review process. Just like the conference goes through a peer review process, the journal goes through the peer review process. In both cases, the peers doing the reviewing are independent. So, for example, I have lots of friends in psychology, and if I'm reviewing a journal article and I notice that, oh, wait, this is a really, really good friend of mine, um, I have to recuse myself from this, and we get somebody else who isn't a really, really good friend. And so experts independently scrutinize the research. They're looking for quality of methodology, appropriateness of conclusion, and so forth and so on. And these reviewers, these peer reviewers, are the gatekeepers to make sure that if something's getting out into the public, whether it's through conferences or through a journal publication, that to the best of our ability, we know that this is accurate, right? We know that the methodology has been appropriate. It doesn't mean that mistakes don't happen. People sometimes lie about their data and the reviewers don't always catch it. Um, Sometimes there are other methodological flaws that were maybe not revealed in the methods section that are discovered afterwards, which is why you will from time to time see journals issue a retraction saying, look, we published this, but we are retracting it. Ignore it. We can no longer support the conclusions in it because we have raised questions about their methodology. Ultimately, though, science is a conversation, and it's built in an iterative process. We learn a little bit more here in this study, we learn a little bit more there in this study. We find the edges of that understanding over here in this study. And so we have this public conversation that there's this public scrutiny primarily from expert to expert, and which is why sometimes you'll see studies move around a little bit with what the conclusion is that can be drawn from it. Although a lot of times when we see that wiggleness, it's normally because they made a methodological error that wasn't picked up by the peer reviewers. Now, it's important for us to understand scientific information can find its place self in all kinds of places. On the internet, right? Certainly in newspapers and especially the big news, NBC, Fox News, CBS, ABC, CNN, they actually have scientific writers, and Associated Press. They actually have scientific writers, scientific journalists who look through journal articles and say, "Oh, this is something that our readers or our viewers would be interested in." And then they take the scientific information and translate it into language that is more accessible to a larger population. Psychology Today is a magazine that does just that, and all they do is focus on psychology. Now, I need to let you know that most of these people who are doing this translation from scientific wording to a broader audience are doing an amazing job, and they do a great job in characterizing it. But sometimes the way that they discuss it might not be quite as specific enough, and you might lose some of the important details in the process. So do keep that in mind. The other piece is that there really isn't a peer review process. Now, most of the time, they don't publish something until it's already gone through the peer review process, but sometimes they do. And without that, we're sometimes in a really squishy science space. So do be cautious of that. Academic journals, on the other hand, are specifically designed for researchers to communicate to other researchers. They're very technical in nature, and as you are learning how to read those journals, do know it might be a little uncomfortable for you, and that's okay. It certainly was for me. I remember when I was a first year graduate student, I probably only understood about 25% of what I was reading in those journal articles. But I quickly learned, and with practice and with new knowledge, I learned more and more. And now, all of these years later, it's hard for me to even imagine how hard it was for me to read those journal articles when I was a first year graduate student. But I remember it was hard. It took a lot of time. And so give yourself some grace and mercy as you're learning how to read those journal articles. Do know that when we talk about magazines versus journals, those magazines are looking for information that they think that their readership or their viewership would be interested in, where journals are really looking for useful but very accurate information to share with their readers. Now, when we take a look at the journal articles themselves, they're not all the same. For some journals, they have little briefs. In fact, they'll call them briefs, where it's just a little summary of something. There's one particular journal in psychology called Current Directions in Psychological Science, which are really short, cute. I shouldn't call them cute, but I think they're cute. Reviews of research, and they're written in a way that it tends to be easier for people who might not be experts to read and to understand. Now, they're still written very scientifically, they still go through the peer review process, but Current Direction in Psychology really is a great first journal for you to dive into to read to get comfortable with how these journals work. And the articles are somewhat between what we're actually going to be talking about. Current Directions has its own approach, but it's definitely something worth reading. And it's not a magazine, it absolutely is a journal with peer review. So, empirical research articles are considered primary sources. They have a hypothesis. You're going to see an intro, you're going to see a method, you're going to see a results section, you're going to see a conclusion. That might be duplicated two or three times if they have multiple studies going on, but really the research articles are about a specific testing, a specific hypothesis and what methodology went through and what data they had. And it goes into a lot of detail on that one, two, or three studies. This is different than a review article. Now, there are two different types of review articles. There are qualitative reviews and there are quantitative reviews. So qualitative, think words, quantitative, think numbers. Your typical review article is a qualitative review. It's a synthesis of all of the literature on a particular topic. So somebody's interested in a topic and they go and they do a complete and thorough literature review. They pull out all of the research articles that have been published in that particular topic that they're looking at. And then they read them all and they read them all again and they think about commonalities and differences and how and patterns that they're seeing. And then they write a review that synthesizes everything in a way. Oftentimes that gives new insight or a fuller, completer picture on a particular topic. Now, meta-analysis kind of does the same thing, but what it does is instead of pulling together all the language and the conclusions and the discussion of it all, it turns each research article into almost like its own little participant, and it quantifies what they find. And then they run a specific type of analysis called a meta-analysis. It's a statistical analysis where, if you think about it, in the empirical research articles, there will be 5, 10, 20, 70, 100 participants, and these are humans or they're animals that you can go to and you can count. In a meta-analysis, it's not participants, it's articles. So this article might have 100 people, and this article might have 120 people, and so forth and so on. But the data are presented on the article level, and the article are treated as participants. It's actually really cool. And by using this particular approach to summarize and synthesize all that's going on in a particular area or topic area, you really get a really nice big picture and get a larger conclusion that builds on all of the work that everybody else has been doing. That concludes our session for today, where we take a look at just a general idea of what makes psychology a science. It's that research that we do, right? And what what does that research method look like very briefly, and how is that then disseminated through or shared through conferences or journal articles? And so as you go through and you think about this, know that this is very much an overview, and you can find more videos that dive into each of these topics a little bit more deeply. But I think probably if I were going to leave you with one big point, is that psychology is a science not because of what we study, but because of how we study it. It's that dance between rationalism and empiricism, not our gut, not what other people tell us. So Um, happy thinking, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the future. Take care.